The child was lying in New York, crippled in front of a wheelchair that had been...
He once played emperors and high priests, men whose words shook nations and whose presence demanded worship. But when Frank Thring died, alone in a Melbourne hospital room in 1994, there was no crown, no audience, just a whisper of a man whose life was as mysterious and theatrical as the characters he portrayed. How did a man who stood before millions on screen end up surrounded by silence in his final days? Frank Thring was not just an actor, he was a spectacle. With a voice like thunder wrapped in silk, a stare that could freeze blood, and a presence so intense it bordered on mythical, Thring dominated every frame he appeared in. From Ben-Hur to King of Kings, he was cast as tyrants, gods, and madmen, roles that mirrored the contradictions of his real life. But behind the ornate robes and commanding voice was a man tormented by isolation, secrecy, and the crushing weight of not belonging. He was flamboyant in public, yet achingly private in his personal life. His sexuality, though whispered about for decades, was never openly discussed during his lifetime. His relationship with his powerful father, one of Australia's cinema pioneers, was strained, cold, and filled with silent expectations. This is not just a story about an actor who played villains. This is about the villainy of fame, the tragedy of being different in a time that demanded conformity, and the chilling truth behind the masks we wear. In this video, we will journey through Frank Thring's spectacular rise, his dark truths, and the legacy he left behind, one that Australia has struggled to remember and the world never truly understood. In the golden haze of post-war Hollywood, where clean-cut heroes and damsels in distress ruled the screen, one man shattered every expectation. Frank Thring was never meant to blend in. With his looming frame, alabaster skin, arched brows, and that deep, thunderous voice soaked in venom and velvet, he was the antithesis of the Hollywood leading man. He didn't need to chase the spotlight. It found him, compelled by the sheer strangeness and power he exuded. Born in 1926 in Melbourne, Australia, Frank Thring was a child of both privilege and shadow. His father, Frank Thring Sr., was a towering figure in early Australian cinema, a distributor, producer, and one of the founding forces behind FT Studios. To the outside world, young Frank was heir to a cinematic dynasty. But within the walls of the family estate, the atmosphere was cold, formal, and suffocating. The elder Thring was a strict, emotionally distant man who ran both his studio and his household with iron discipline. Love was a performance, and approval was a prize rarely awarded. Frank Jr. grew up surrounded by art, theater, and the intoxicating power of show business. But he also inherited something far more corrosive, a sense of otherness. Even as a boy, Frank knew he didn't quite fit. He was drawn to the theatrical, the grandiose, the strange. His voice deepened unnaturally early. His tastes veered toward the dramatic and the dark. In a conservative, masculine Australia, this was not just unusual, it was dangerous. By his early 20s, Frank had carved out a reputation in the Melbourne theater scene. He wasn't just good, he was unforgettable. Audiences were drawn not just to his talent, but to the mystery he exuded. Was he mocking them? Seducing them? Was he even real? He spoke like a Shakespearean monarch, dressed like a fallen aristocrat, and carried himself like a man from another century. Critics couldn't look away, and neither could casting directors. Soon, Hollywood came calling. His performance as Pontius Pilate in Ben-Hur, 1959, catapulted him into the global spotlight. He followed with roles in King of Kings and El Cid, becoming a typecast symbol of decadence and corruption. But while the world saw a man ascending, inside Frank was unraveling. He once said, "I play all these powerful men, but I've never felt in control of anything." This contradiction became the central tension of his life, the grandeur of his screen persona versus the quiet torment of his private self. The more powerful he appeared, the more invisible he felt. In the era of tabloid witch hunts and brutal censorship of homosexuality, Frank learned to build walls behind the robes and roles. His flamboyance was both armor and bait. It drew attention, but kept the truth hidden in plain sight. Australia, too, had a conflicted relationship with Frank. While he was celebrated abroad, at home he was often reduced to a caricature, too eccentric, too dramatic, too not one of us. In the 1970s and 80s, he returned to Melbourne and became a television personality, often appearing on talk shows, variety specials, and in theater productions. He was witty, acid-tongued, and unfiltered. He became beloved for his outrageousness, but rarely understood for his pain. And behind the curtain of this grand life, darker truths brewed. Failed marriages, loneliness, alcohol, depression, an aching sense of disconnection from both the industry and the country that made him. Frank Thring became a man out of time, haunted by the legacy he was expected to uphold and the identity he was never allowed to embrace. Frank Thring's ascent was never typical. He didn't climb the ladder rung by rung. He exploded into the scene, larger than life, impossible to ignore. In the smoke and shadows of post-war theater, his presence was electrifying. Audiences gasped when he stepped onto the stage, not because he was famous, but because he carried the weight of myth before ever becoming one. His early years with the Union Theatre Repertory Company, which would later evolve into the Melbourne Theatre Company, showcased his unparalleled gift for the grotesque and grand. He played Iago, Herod, Satan, and a kaleidoscope of twisted kings and haunted men. His diction was precise, his timing venomous, and his gestures exaggerated like opera. He wasn't subtle, and he didn't want to be. Frank believed performance should be visceral, theatrical, and unforgettable. This theatrical power drew international eyes. In the late 1950s, director William Wyler was casting Ben-Hur, one of the largest film productions of the era. Thring was cast as Pontius Pilate, a role that demanded icy authority and moral ambiguity. He delivered both in spades. His scenes shimmered with menace. Unlike other actors in the film, Thring didn't seem to be playing Roman nobility. He was it. Regal, cruel, weary, and amused all at once. The success of Ben-Hur led to King of Kings, where he portrayed Herod Antipas, another villain, another crown. His performances were so iconic that critics began to wonder if Thring was cursed by his own ability. He could command a screen, but only ever as a tyrant, a freak, or a devil. He was not the man Hollywood would cast as a romantic lead, nor the friend, nor the everyman. He was a symbol, a dangerous, beautiful, terrifying one. By the early 1960s, Thring was living in England and making appearances on British television and stage, continuing to enchant and unsettle audiences in equal measure. But despite the acclaim, the cracks were beginning to show. He suffered from insomnia, anxiety, and what we now understand as depression. In interviews, he would vacillate between sardonic brilliance and chilling honesty. "People don't know what to make of me," he once said. "Sometimes neither do I." He briefly married actress Joan Cunliffe in 1955. The marriage lasted less than a year. Publicly, it was dismissed as a mismatch. Privately, friends whispered that it was a desperate attempt to quell the growing rumors about his sexuality. The truth, known but unspoken in theatrical circles, was that Frank Thring was gay at a time when homosexuality was criminalized and socially condemned in both Australia and England. The flamboyance that made him a star also made him a target. Returning to Australia in the late 1960s, Frank became a staple of the local theater scene and a regular presence on talk shows and variety TV. He appeared in cult films like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome and The Man from Snowy River 2, often playing characters who were equal parts majestic and monstrous. To younger Australians, he became something of a camp icon, a walking contradiction of elegance and wickedness. But while his screen persona thrived, his inner life deteriorated. He battled alcoholism, retreated further from the public when not performing, and often spoke in cryptic, morbid jokes. He lived alone in a Gothic-style house in Melbourne, filled with memorabilia, antiques, and silence. His health began to fail, accelerated by years of heavy drinking and isolation. Yet he never stopped performing. In his final years, he continued to act, lend his voice to radio, and appear on television, his body frailer, but his voice still thundering like a sermon from the altar. Frank Thring lived a life of contradictions. He was adored yet misunderstood, flamboyant yet guarded, powerful on screen but fragile off it. His rise was meteoric, but the price was immense. Typecasting, loneliness, and a legacy too strange for mainstream celebration. He once joked, "I'll never be a national treasure. I'm more of a national curiosity." That curiosity would soon darken into tragedy, and the world would finally begin to understand just how much he had hidden behind the velvet curtain. The curtain never truly dropped on Frank Thring. It simply grew heavier, more impenetrable, until even the people closest to him no longer knew where the performance ended and the man began. His final years weren't just lonely, they were haunted by ghosts. The ghost of his father's stern legacy, the ghost of roles that clung to him like old costumes, and the ghost of a self he was never permitted to fully become. As the 1980s waned, so too did Thring's health. Decades of heavy drinking had left his body weakened. He suffered from respiratory problems, diabetes, and liver disease. He walked more slowly, sat more often, and leaned heavier on the sharp wit that once entertained crowds but now veiled his pain. On television, he still captivated. His laugh remained theatrical, his voice still resonant, but it was clear something deeper was unraveling. Behind the facade of the grand thespian was a man plagued by regret. Friends noted that he often spoke in riddles, morbid phrases, and cryptic metaphors. "You know," he once said to a colleague, "it's quite something to be remembered for being someone you never were." To those who knew how carefully Frank curated his public image, the statement struck like a confession. He had spent his life portraying monstrous power, but in truth, he had been powerless to live openly. Australia in the 1950s through 1980s was a hostile place for queer men, especially those in the public eye. Frank's homosexuality was an open secret, acknowledged in whispers but never confirmed. He had no long-term partner, no public romantic life. He laughed off questions or deflected with sarcasm. "I'm married to the theater," he would say. Ironic, given that even on stage he rarely got to play someone in love. There were no tell-all interviews, no memoirs, no public reclamation of his truth. And yet, within the theater community, many knew. They simply didn't speak of it, not out of malice, but out of habit. Silence was how things were done. What broke that silence in the end wasn't Frank, it was death. In December 1994, Frank Thring passed away in a private hospital in Melbourne. There was no grand tribute, no state funeral, no documentary retrospective. His death was marked with a few obituaries, many of which focused more on his voice and his bizarre presence than on the man beneath. He died alone, without a partner, without children, and without the closure his complex life deserved. After his death, fragments of the truth began to emerge. Former colleagues spoke, carefully, of the isolation he endured. A theater producer recalled how Frank would show up early to rehearsals and sit silently for hours, staring into space. A longtime friend mentioned that Frank's home was filled with letters he had written but never sent. Letters to his father, to old lovers, to no one in particular. One of the most heartbreaking recollections came from a stagehand who worked with him on a 1990s production. He once said, "I've played kings, gods, monsters, but never myself. And maybe that's why I've lasted this long. Or maybe that's why I've faded away." In the years following his death, there was a quiet reassessment of his legacy. Film scholars began to revisit his performances, not as camp curiosities, but as tragic masterpieces of typecasting. Critics who once dismissed him as too theatrical now praised his commitment, his precision, and the vulnerability hidden behind the grandeur. Still, even now, Frank Thring's life remains partially veiled. There are no comprehensive biographies, no detailed documentaries, just scattered pieces, interviews, anecdotes, images that hint at a story more profound and painful than anyone dared to fully tell while he lived. He was a man who used his voice to dominate because the world never gave him the space to simply speak. It's easy to reduce Frank Thring to a theatrical curiosity, a man with a booming voice, strange mannerisms, and a flair for the outrageous. But to do so is to miss the profound tragedy, complexity, and cultural weight of who he truly was. At Aussie Uncovered, we don't see Frank Thring as just an actor. We see him as a symbol of otherness, of resilience, of brilliance misunderstood in its own time. Frank Thring was never meant to be a conventional star. He didn't smile on cue or fit the mold of matinee idols. He was born to command, to unsettle, to make audiences feel something they couldn't quite name. And that power, the ability to disturb and enchant simultaneously, is precisely what made him extraordinary. Yet it also doomed him to roles that were boxed, labeled, and far removed from his true emotional range. He had the presence of an emperor, but the soul of a solitary poet. Beneath the ornate costumes and biting wit was a man weighed down by the expectations of a conservative society, an unforgiving industry, and a family legacy that never allowed him to breathe freely. His flamboyance wasn't vanity, it was survival. His sarcasm wasn't arrogance, it was a defense against a world that mocked what it didn't understand. In many ways, Thring's career is a cautionary tale about how fame can amplify the image while starving the individual. He played men of absolute power, yet he was powerless to live authentically in the public eye. Even in death, the man remained elusive. No partner came forward, no confidante published a memoir, no loved one stepped into the light to reveal the inner workings of his heart. All that remains is the work, and even that is under-celebrated. And yet, we must not forget the gift he left behind. His performances, especially in Ben-Hur, King of Kings, and countless stage roles, are testaments to the kind of acting that transcends fashion. He turned even the smallest moments into rituals. He didn't just speak lines, he invoked them. Watching Frank Thring perform was like watching a storm wear a crown. Should he have been more recognized? Undoubtedly. Should Australia do more to honor his legacy? Absolutely. But perhaps part of Frank's enduring mystique is that he never belonged entirely to us, or to anyone. He was of the theater, of the screen, of the shadows. And maybe that's why he still lingers, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a question we still haven't answered. What do you think? Was Frank Thring a prisoner of his own persona, or was he in full control all along? Was he forgotten, or did he choose to be unknowable? We invite you to look beyond the makeup, the costumes, the robes and rings, and see the man who dared to be different before the world was ready. Because hidden in the silence between his booming lines, there was always something aching to be heard. Some actors are remembered for their beauty, others for their charm, their awards, their headlines. But Frank Thring, he is remembered for something stranger, something more enduring, the feeling he left behind. That eerie sense that you just witnessed something ancient, wounded, and deeply human hiding behind a mask of grandeur. He never asked for your sympathy. He didn't beg for understanding. Instead, he stood like a statue against the tide, untouched, enigmatic, and slightly amused. And yet, there was a sadness in his stillness, a longing in his theatricality. He played tyrants who demanded loyalty, kings who ruled with disdain, and gods who hid fear beneath robes of silk. But the truth is, Frank Thring didn't need to pretend. Those roles were reflections of his own inner kingdom, beautiful, haunted, unreachable. In the decades since his passing, Australia has struggled to place him within its cultural pantheon. He was too theatrical for mainstream celebration, too private for posthumous myth-making. But for those who remember, for those who saw him command a stage with a glance, or deliver a line that echoed for days, he is unforgettable. We often talk about legacy as something built, carved, awarded. But for Frank, legacy is quieter. It's in the hushed awe of a theater student discovering his performance for the first time. It's in the knowing smiles of older actors who recall the man who never followed the rules. It's in the bittersweet laughter that erupts when someone repeats his wicked one-liners, not realizing they're quoting a ghost. Frank Thring may never have fit the world he was born into, but perhaps that was never the point. He belonged to the in-between, to the liminal space between myth and man, truth and performance, fame and anonymity. And maybe that's why he still lingers. Some stories are never told, but now you know. And somewhere, in a dim theater or an old film reel, he waits, robes swaying, eyes glinting, voice rumbling, ready to remind us that to be truly unforgettable, you must first dare to be entirely, unapologetically strange.